Consolation and desolation. This is what we're working our way through this year. And before we dive into this month's commitment, our commitment to simplicity, which remember, simplicity is about having a commitment to having a simple relationship with things like food, clothing, technology, and possessions. But before we get into it a bit on simplicity, I want to talk a little bit about St. Ignatius's rules for the discernment of spirits. So in St. Ignatius's rules for the discernment of spirits, he's trying to help people come to be able to have a good grasp of and be attentive to the interior movements that are happening. It's those interior movements where our disposition shifts either towards God and the things of God, that's consolation, or away from God and the things of God, and sort of by extension towards things that are likely to continue to draw us away from attentiveness to God and God's goodness or God's gifts. So it's in desolation that we get drawn to what Ignatius calls low and earthly things. And the reason he's trying to teach us to pay attention to these interior movements is to help us understand that we actually don't have to be passive in what is happening in that interior space. That there is what he calls the bad spirit or the evil spirit, which is, it's hard to completely define what he means by this, but he always has in mind, at least to some degree, the influence of the enemy, the little lies that the enemy whispers into our ears. And so there are these two different kinds of movements that are operating in our interior world. But he also talks about the reality that in addition to these interior movements in our soul, these feelings of consolation and desolation, or we might again describe them as feelings of being, consolation as this feeling of hope and courage and energy rising up inside of us for things that are good and holy, and desolation as the opposite of all of that. That feeling of discouragement that can come, or those feelings when we're drawn to things that feel like temptations to check out or to self-medicate or to disappear. So in addition to all of that inner movement going on, Ignatius tries to help us see that these interior feelings have further consequences for us. These feelings sort of dispose us to particular ways of perceiving the world around us, or the conversations that we're a part of and the ways that we might respond to those things. So there's this reciprocal relationship between these interior movements of our soul and the way that we move through the world as a result of what is happening in there. And so these feelings of consolation and desolation, they can cause us to, for example, remember particular experiences or forget other experiences, because the interior state of our soul draws our attention to certain things and it causes us to forget other things. And these observations from Ignatius are all supported, by the way, by modern psychology. Modern psychology tells us that if you believe, for example, that you don't belong to a certain group of friends, or maybe you feel discouraged by something that recently happened, if you have this complex set of emotions and beliefs operating at a deep level, you will see the world through the lens of your own feelings. So we have a tendency to project out onto the world what we're experiencing in our interior life. We'll more naturally notice the things out in the world that support the stuff that is happening in our interior world. And so in the 16th century, Ignatius was really onto something. Again, there is a reciprocal relationship between the interior movements of consolation and desolation and the present vision we have of the past or of the future, or how we're navigating the current concrete situation that we're in right now. And so, like many others in the monastic tradition before him, Ignatius was trying to teach us how to pay attention. And what he does is he develops these rules for how to respond on the days or in the seasons when we find ourselves in consolation, and how to respond to days and seasons of desolation. And what I want to focus on here a little bit this month and in the upcoming months are some of these rules of discernment that Ignatius lays out for us for what to do during these times of consolation and what to do during times of desolation. So really briefly, the three primary rules when you find yourself in desolation. First is to do the work of becoming aware. So we've already touched on this a bit, but essentially, Ignatius reminds us that when we are in a state of desolation and we reflect on ourselves in desolation, we can quickly recognize that if I'm able to reflect on this part of me that is experiencing desolation, then I can recognize that it's just a part of my experience of the world. There is this other part of me that is able to take a step back and do the work of observation. That's the first step. We can set the desolation up as something to be observed. Like, what is causing the desolation, or what feelings are emerging from it, and what are the consequences of the desolation that we can begin to see sort of surface to the top. That's the first step. The second step that Ignatius talks about for these times of desolation is to resist changing any of the decisions that you made while you were in consolation. And by this, he's referring to the kind of well-made decisions about the kind of life we're pursuing in community, or the kind of service that we want to engage in, or how we've already decided to pursue our spiritual life. He's saying, look, when you are in desolation, it's not the right time to negotiate whether or not you're going to wake up and pray, or whether you're going to lead that discussion group at your church, or whether or not you're going to meet with your spiritual director. Just sit tight in your desolation and keep the spiritual commitments that you've already made. You can reevaluate those commitments during a time of consolation when you've sort of returned to a place of peace. In fact, the third step builds on this. So in the third step, Ignatius says, not only should you not change your spiritual practices or the commitments that you made while you're in consolation, but there are ways that you might need to change your disposition. You might need to find ways to push back against and to fight against that pull on you that shows up during that time of desolation. So just a brief recap. Become aware and seek to understand what is happening in you during a time of desolation. That's the first step. Resist changing any decisions. That's the second step. And then third, find some ways to push back against the desolation. So let's turn now to this month's commitment and to try to use this month's commitment as a place where we can begin to practice these three steps. So in our commitment to simplicity, we have a commitment to have a simple relationship with food, technology, clothing, and possessions. So these four areas, they have some historic significance within the monastic tradition, because these are all areas where humans are sort of naturally drawn towards complexity. Historically, less so with technology, but I don't think anyone would argue too much about how our relationship with technology in the 21st century is quite complex and is something we just need to pay attention to. So we self-medicate with too much or maybe even too little food. Our present culture is quite easily drawn into technology. There's a long history of clothing being a symbol of status and comfort. And of course, wealth and the accumulation of possessions has always been something that the monastic tradition is trying to speak to. So in seasons of desolation, oftentimes we're drawn towards these things to soothe the desolation. And these four areas are prime candidates for being places where this desolation might seek solace or comfort. And so to practice these three steps in Ignatius's rules of discernment during desolation might look like this. First, we'd want to become aware of how we're being drawn into deeper complexity within these four areas. So for me, I notice that in times of desolation or stress, I'm much more likely to get sucked into wasting time scrolling on Twitter or Instagram. I also notice that my relationship with food changes during times of desolation. And so in Ignatius's first step, I'm just becoming aware of what's happening. I'm trying to notice and reflect and watch myself react to being in desolation. Ignatius wants me to turn my attention to how I'm responding to myself being in desolation. And so given my commitment to having a simple relationship with these four areas, in our commitment to our rule of life, I would want to pay particular attention to these areas. And secondly, whatever my commitment to the practice of simplicity in these areas might be, Ignatius would want me to not change anything in my commitments during this time of desolation. So for example, if I'm committed to fasting 1 day a week, and I made a decision to do so while I was in a season of consolation and feeling that as an invitation from God, Ignatius would want me to keep that commitment to fasting. Or if in a time of consolation, I decided that I'm going to shut my phone off at 6 p.m. as a general practice, but during desolation, I feel like I want to watch random YouTube videos, Ignatius would say, keep whatever commitments that you made during consolation. Keep these commitments intact while you are during your season of desolation. So if I've committed to be generous and give away some portion of my income, and I've made some commitment to this during a time of consolation, however I might be tempted to change this during a time of desolation, Ignatius's instructions for me would be, don't do it. Just keep the commitments that you've made in consolation while you are going through the desolation. And lastly, Ignatius wants us to fight back against the desolation. So we'll dive deeper into this third step later this year, because it actually contains a couple sub-steps. But essentially, what Ignatius wants us to do in this third step is to fight against the desolation. And so if I feel a bit of stinginess come upon me during a time of desolation, let's say I'm in desolation and I'm tempted to not support that cause that I'm used to supporting, or I'm struggling to give generously to my local church, Ignatius says that we should act against those thoughts and temptations through doubling down on our efforts. And so if we've committed to keep our social media engagement to 30 minutes a day, for example, but we feel in this season of desolation like we could spend a couple of hours just scrolling, and we're fighting against that temptation, Ignatius might instruct us to just shut it down altogether as a way of pushing back and fighting back. Or if we're committed to giving 5% of our income to missions, Ignatius might say, if you're in a season of desolation and you're feeling tempted to not give generously, give more. Fight against the temptation in an active way. So friends, here are 3 steps that Ignatius gives us to fight against the pull that desolation can have on us. And this month, we've used these 3 steps within the context of our commitment to simplicity. We've sort of zeroed in on these 4 areas of food and clothing, technology, and possessions, just as a learning exercise. But the rules of discernment and these 3 steps can be applied to any area of our spiritual life and our commitments. So friends, as always, we have a few things for you to think through this month in preparation for your time with your formation group. Much love and grace to you.